Hello, I'm Andy Neumann, Fixtured Tool Product Specialist here at Atlas Copco. Today's lesson will be on how to set the limits for a PST press system. So setting limits. Typically our customers only give us very basic limits. So typically just the final torque and maybe the final force. We're going to use these limits or additional limits to ensure product quality. We can also do this at many different levels to give us error proofing. And we can use this to detect variations in the parts or the process. So when we look at press, again, the customer only gives us some very basic limits. So it's basically press to a force, and sometimes they don't even know what that force is. So sometimes they give us absolute nothing. And we can set limits on both depth, which would be stroke, and force, which would be, again, the force that we see from the PST. Also, for fastening, our customers only give us some very basic limits, and typically they're only the final limits. So they're going to give us a plus or minus on the torque, and very rarely do they give us angle limits. So we have several different ways of setting limits. The first one is restrictions. Restrictions stop the process. So as soon as we break a restriction, the process is stopped. We can make decisions on what to do once it's stopped using reject management, but restrictions will stop the process. We can add them to any step of the program that we need, and they're typically only high limits. So once a high limit is broken, the process is stopped, and then through reject management, we'll make our decisions on what we're going to do with that. We then have our next level, which are checks. And again, checks happen after the fact. They're also possible in all steps. Gives us some additional levels of error proofing, and with this we can check and catch part problems. So checks, again, happen after the fact, but again, they're a valuable part of error proofing. And then finally, we have monitoring. So monitoring is done at the end of the process, so that's in the CE step. That's typically what we're going to use to make our final okay, not okay decision. And these are typically the limits that are dictated by the customer. So they really only care about the final product and give us the final limits, which are set up in monitoring. But we can do, again, restrictions or checks throughout the process, giving us limits that help ensure the quality. If we're going to do limits, one of the important things that we need to do is gather some data. So in order to get data, we need to install those restrictions or those checks or those monitoring items within our program. Typically, we'll put these in with no limits in place, so we're not going to cause any sort of rejects. We're simply going to generate data that we can use to help set these limits. So instead of it just being a guess at what they should be, we're going to use the data to dictate what those limits are. So again, we need to add these variables. So when we're gathering data, we've put in our checks or our restrictions. We want to see the numbers that are coming from those. And the main reason we don't put in limits is so that we get numbers. And to see these numbers, we're going to have to add them to the screen reporter. So the screen reporter is a device that's on every PowerMac setup. We're going to just, if we've added checks or restrictions, we're going to have to drag those variables, so the data that's gathered by those, into our reporter so that we can see them on the screen. As well as seeing them on the screen, that means that the PowerMac is automatically going to keep those limits so that we can later go back and check them and use that data to generate the limits that we're going to install. So again, the PowerMac 4000 stores the data. We can go to the cycle data screen and we can see that data. We also have a button on the cycle data screen called Get Cycle Data, which allows us to export this data. And once we have it exported, we can use those numbers to help analyze the data to generate our limits. So we're going to go to the cycle data screen. We're going to click on Get Cycle Data. That's going to create a CSV file. And once we have a CSV file, we can now import that into Excel and use Excel to analyze that data and get us good numbers to use for our limits. You want to do probably at least 30 cycles. So again, the more samples that you do, the more secure your limits are going to be. And again, you can do this during normal production. That's why we don't put any limits. So we're not going to give the customer any false rejects. We're just going to put in the checks or restrictions that we want, add them to the reporter, and run, as many cycles as we can, typically at least 30, to get us a decent sample size to make the decisions, to make the calculations that we're going to use to set our limits. We're going to take that data and we're going to bring it into Excel. So again, the get cycle data will generate a CSV file, bring it into Excel, and then use some of the simple Excel functions. So we're going to generate the mean. So what is the typical value that we see from these limits or restrictions? And then we're going to use the little calculation. So right up there under auto sum, we also have standard deviation. So we're going to get our sigma, and we're going to use those values to generate the limits that we want to put into the process. A good starting point is plus or minus 4.5 sigma. So you can see the bigger your sigma, the larger the population that you're going to allow through the limits. Again, we want to set this tight enough to catch bad parts, but we don't want to set it so wide that we're going to just pass everything. So a good starting point is plus or minus 4.5 sigma. Once we have those values, then we're going to actually plug them into the program. So here we've had the check angle, and again, when we put it in to gather our data, we didn't put in any limits. Now that we have our values, we can actually plug in those limits. So here we're using a high angle limit of 40, a low angle limit of 10, and then for peak torque, 30 to 149. And again, these are typically going to be in steps prior to that final step, because the final step limits are the ones that the customer is going to give us. These are limits that we're going to add to catch things going wrong in the process before we get to the final. So again, now we've got the limits installed. We're going to run some production parts, and those parts are now going to be better checked. So we're going to detect more things going wrong than just at the end of the cycle saying, oh yeah, that was a not okay. By detecting things going wrong prior to getting to those final steps of the program, we're going to be able to probably repair them or at least not create scrap. So overall, limits are something that we add, so some of the added value that Atlas Copco brings to the table, and it's going to help improve the overall quality of the customer's parts. Thanks for taking time and viewing our lesson. I hope it was helpful. If you have any further questions, please reach out to your Atlas Copco Product Specialist. Thank you.